Welcome to TradeTheNBA.com. This is John. This report is for the 23rd, ending the week. Well, we started off with the short signal, and let's see how that developed. That's right there where the magenta moves below the yellow. At the same time, we had red below blue. And while we were in this continuation long setup, this was the first indications of softness. Wasn't horrible. Like I mentioned before too, when you see the spike up of red, that's usually going to be your pop. But if it continues lower, and since you didn't get magenta back up over yellow, the expectation would be that you would continue to fade. And given what we're seeing here, it should continue to fade as well, particularly if we get this blue under the green. You will have completely ended the uptrade. Of course, the potential for that turnaround on the low end of it is a potential possibility. That's why the expectation would be that you would continue to see magenta and yellow falling significantly. And even if green pops up, the ideal situation is having yellow moving below it. That's what we see intraday. Now, of course, this is taking place even with cyan still under red. It's just your long-term buyers have been fading out of this, and that's caused a little bit more difficulty for the short-term buyers to really keep things moving. From an NQ standpoint, much earlier, as it broke down right about there, and it's actually been in a little bit worse condition just generally. I mean, that's been a straight down line. It's already across the green line here on the MBI, and you've been in a DOC spread here for some time. So that's why the NASDAQ is just a little softer at this particular point. From a gold standpoint, I think that's just going to be a continuation build, a little soft right here in the same kind of configuration, but holding up. And the reason being, it's a little bit different, as you notice that the white fading lower as opposed to continuing higher. Coupled with, we're looking at a pivot here, so that's probably going to hold on to it. Euro continues to just explode as it becomes apparent that the U.S. is just going to keep spending beyond money. And speaking of, the holy grails, you're not supposed to talk negative about Bitcoin, but, we had that sell, what was it, 7-8 days ago here, back up at the 64,000 range. So talk about a, 25% haircut on Bitcoin from a future standpoint. Yeah. So much for the perennial. Now, this means it's not going to pop back up. But again, that's a pretty significant move from what was supposed to be the perennial moving, straight upward. Moving to the 5K. So some fun new things that you can notice on here. The little green dots here are just the tightening up of when we have the dip of the red below the zero level, and then we have our pivots up of green, blue, and the magenta over the yellow. And what that's going to do is going to get us a little bit tighter into those buy configurations, particularly coming off of short dips where it flips around. It's just going to make it that much cleaner. Coupled with the recognition of, and we talked about this one with the yellow and the dark brown where, that's your continuation lower, and as soon as it stops, that's exactly where it comes in. So it's recognizing that transition in the algo quite nicely, and plays out quite well throughout most of the chart going all the way back. There are a few little caveats that I have to work out because really it comes into a play of sort of like what we have with the P2 pivots from DOC Red. Similar concept when it comes to the red setup here, looking for higher pivots. We'll do it, and not all the time do they dip below zero, and so I have to fill in a few of those. But overall, that's just going to bring us tighter and tighter to exact flips, and in a lot of cases, coming off of declines, it really captures literally the beginning of that turnaround. So from an intraday standpoint, some decent moves to the south side. it was a decent long signal. It just, you can see where it began to fade, because your expectation is when you get this pivot up that you see this kind of a action, this straight up vertical. And what did we get as soon as we got it? Yellow started to fade a little bit, started to rebuild, but it couldn't get any momentum. And it wasn't until the second push up that it started to actually capture that higher momentum. And you can see here, you get the higher red pivots. Here it was lower, so you expected kind of a little soft push up and then higher one, and that led to the takeoff. And it was pretty decent overall. I mean, we're still catching it. It was just a little bit later in that run, looking at the pivot. So the idea is just to get a little tighter with those, and probably not have it do the color shift at all. So it's just a matter of adjusting how the formula sets up, because even from this at 58, the low is down to 53, well within what we would normally consider from a stop location. So seeing that pivot in there from there, I mean, this could just as easily just remain a long run. Those are some little finer points that we dig through. So then we ended up with Magenta coming in a little bit early, and it did that exact same pivot up right there, but we already knew this because we talked about it as it was happening, because we ended up with that, which is the red line below the zero, and probably going to be putting in language that will eliminate that configuration as well, just so we don't get those magenta candles there like that. It'll either stay with trend, and mostly this is because of that break below the 76%, but we know that we can get those and still have a turnaround. So just a little bit of fine-tuning on some of those, but then when it did become clear on this breakdown, and we didn't go below the zero there, that's when we started to get the follow-through, and then we ended up with a much lower. That was a real deep move. That was like almost 4.91 on the dip below the red, so it did not take long for that up pivot, and that's where that green captured it well before the yellow candle. Actually, there should be colored yellow. Some people point out to me that you're seeing fewer of the yellow, orange, and even blue buy signals, and it's not that they aren't there, it's just that we're capturing them much earlier with the new configuration of the white candles and the dark green from the white dots. And that's where it shows up in the dark green when you see the white dots. They just appear dark green. That was just to differentiate from the other white candle MBIs. So that's the only differential there. And I expect that's going to get even moved back further. And so you eliminate this one, because you would end up with, the capture around 47 versus 50. It's an extra few points. It just makes it easier to transition, and the secondary one that I'll be working with too is where we have these shakeouts that are in the deep red, creating situations where we're capturing a higher red pivot secondarily, and that will avoid these little pops. So the thing is, these little pops, you can still, if you're catching them early enough, like we will down here, then yeah, you can catch 4 or 5 points before it starts to roll over, which is pretty clear, because that'll be another exclusion. When we get over 45 with the red and magenta from those, it's not an ideal setup to be buying. You can see it even happens on this one as well, right after it comes in. So before it's fine, and then boom, it comes in. You kind of know that you're sort of peaking out at that particular stage. And then we ended up with a, clear that one. Rollover that happened. So again, this is a decent turnaround configuration, but the added setup I'm putting in there as well, like we talked about before, is when you don't have a steel dip down below the 1 level, when you get above the 13, it usually just starts to trail off, and it corresponded exactly with when it bended before. So this becomes one of those where, if you're going with that up move, and that's where that blue little dot right there is another configuration that I'm working with on getting this, because sometimes you'll get couple of them pivot, and you'll still have the magenta already over, so there's no immediate crossover, or it happened a little bit earlier, and that's where you just have to catch those, because we know what we're looking for when we see this. It's just a matter of fine-tuning all of the variations that can happen and still be spot on with it. But as the yellow dips below the green, that's usually what I look for. And then we talked about this before, when that cross comes about, typically though, you would get the magenta popping above. When it didn't pop above, oh boy, that's when you know that you've got yourself potential, because the yellow pivoted lower and started to move down, and it was clear at that point, and that's really what led to that very nice breakdown within there. And then ended up with the GAM was a little early because it is deep, and you can see there was no reset. So it rolled just fractionally. I mean, it wasn't a whole lot of move lower. It went from 23 to 15. But in my view, it'd be nice to avoid some of those dip points, knowing that you're going to need to see some more shakeout improvement. And so then by the secondary run coming across, when it popped up here with all the configurations of the blue-green pivot with the magenta and that, everything rising, that's what really led to the strong up move. Before creating a similar configuration, it's just before that cross of the blue, which is where the actual dark red pops in. So it's a matter of looking to capture some of those. And from my viewpoint, it's like we talked about the breakdown, as long as you get below the 33, when you have the up pivots of the red, that's usually the opportune time, because that's where you're getting your peak move. And then it's just a matter of the red dipping. So it's a question of if the magenta had stayed below in this particular case on the red up pivot, then that becomes a real excellent one. The fact that it was above it, I would hold as well. And so you had to wait for it to actually pivot lower on that one. So nothing you can do about that situation. It's going to happen. But here you can see on the reversal part, green as well as the blue captured both exact same spot outside of where we're getting the yellow and brown setups in there, and boom, it was perfect within that configuration. And that leads us to where we're at right over here. Again, excellent from the turnaround by configuration, and like we were just talking, this kind of dip down we captured a little earlier, particularly when we know we have the white uptick, and particularly if we're still with red above the 10 levels, when it gets into that oversold, that you get these little pop-ups. And that's exactly what this is, as you can see it. Rides exactly with how price went on that, and then begins to roll over, and that's where we're in that rollover stage right now. Is it significant enough to continue to follow through? Well, it's holding there now, so until it changes, yeah, actually a move up of white above the 10 would be a stronger indication that you're going to get the further breakdown. So that's some of the exciting things, and certainly I imagine by the weekend I'll have all of that filled in and completed. It's just a lot of tedious language to add to it, but I think it's going to be extraordinarily helpful for everyone. As always though, trade well. We'll talk to you later.